Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome Jonathan Spire. This evening, we're going to be dealing with Israel and the geopolitical situation. And Jonathan Spire is an expert in international relations and geopolitics. And it is our great pleasure to have him here with us this evening. Good evening, Dr. Jonathan Spire.
Good evening, Marco. Thank you for inviting me.
The pleasure is ours. Jonathan, I think probably the most appropriate place to start this evening in the aftermath of President-elect Trump's victory is to start with Donald J. Trump himself. What kind of changes do you see, if any, in the political situation in the Middle East?
Well, I think since this is Donald Trump's second term, we do have precedent to look at to inform us on this. And if we look at President Trump's Middle East strategy in his first term, we can immediately see some very significant differences between that and what we've just experienced over the last years of the Biden presidency. I think most specifically, perhaps most importantly, with regard to Western strategy towards Islamic Republic of Iran, I think that here you really have a paradigmatic difference between the two administrations. Trump famously conducted a strategy of what he called maximum pressure on the Iranians, which was intended to deprive the regime of the financial capacity to pursue its goal of domination of the Middle East. This was partially successful, I would say, was showing signs of some success and was completely abandoned by the Biden administration, which has spent three fruitless years, really up until 2023, trying to induce Iran back into normal behavior, a stance which the Iranians were not remotely interested in complying with. So 2 years were spent trying to induce in the negotiations in Vienna the Iranians to return to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal of Obama signed in 2015. And nothing came of that. They were not interested. Money came back to the Iranians as a result of maximum pressure. The money was used to support the Iranian militia and proxy stance across the region. And the result, as we now see from, I'm sitting here in Jerusalem, certainly from an Israeli point of view, is that Iran is waging war now on, you can count it, five, six fronts in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, and in Yemen against Israel. And as a result, also against Western interests, for example, with the Houthi movement in the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea. This is the sum total of the change from Trumpian maximum pressure to Biden and Harris's strategy of appeasement of Iran. And the signs are that this is now set to change once again, back to a policy of pressure. We're already hearing that Brian Hook, who was the architect of the maximum pressure strategy, is going to be looks to be appointed by the new Trump administration to put together the new Iran and regional policy. So we're going to be going back, I think, to a policy of rolling back, hopefully also of backing of allies. That's what the Trump #1 regional strategy looked like. That's what, at least in my estimation, the moment now demands. And certainly, I hope and expect that that's what we'll see in the new Trump administration when after it is inaugurated, of course, in January.
Indeed, indeed. How do you think he's going to get things back on track? Because it's going to be very difficult to pick up where he left off because the situation has undergone significant changes in the meantime. So, how does he pick up from where he left off? Indeed, the situation having changed so much, do you think he will have to modify his approach at this stage?
Well, I would say that there are a number of immediate urgent demands on Western Middle East policy. If there is a desire for a new policy of assertiveness. Most importantly, from a Western point of view, the Houthis' attacks on shipping on the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea route have served to effectively shut down that route. 90% of shipping heading through that route has now ceased to do so, and now it goes through all the way down through the Cape, across the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and up again, adding on, I can't remember, 8 or 9 days of travel time,
Indeed, yes.
commercial shipping, and massively increasing costs, which are then, of course, handed on to the consumer. That is not a war against Israel. It's not a war against any Middle Eastern state. The Houthis may be carrying out that campaign in support of Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, but it's a direct attack on on a Western target. The United States, since World War II, has been the accepted guarantor, the United States Navy, I mean, has been the accepted guarantor of maritime security globally. That's been a role that America took upon itself. This is the most flagrant, successful violation of the security of the seas uh, in living memory, I think. I don't remember a similar moment to what the Houthis, a ragtag militia, let us remember, have achieved. It is therefore a matter of urgency that this issue be addressed and that the Houthi campaign be brought to a close and brought to a close, if necessary, by force. If necessary, by force, not only against the Houthis themselves and their targets, but perhaps also against those who are backing them, namely the Iranian naval forces of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. So the Yemen file is an urgent one, I would say. The resumption of sanctions against Iran with regard to its nuclear activities, and indeed recognition of the fact that the Iranians are now only days away, should they wish to do so, from having sufficient enriched uranium to produce an atomic device. This has fallen off the radar screen because of the very dramatic events in the region over the last year, but it remains perhaps the most serious file of them all with regard to the region. So a US administration will need to address that urgent matter as well. And I would suggest, given that the war in Israel against Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon is ongoing and does not appear close to conclusion, I would suggest that any US administration will need to perhaps recalibrate the levels of support available to Israel with regard to what needs to be done. What do I mean by that? Biden has, of course, provided extensive material support to Israel, but Biden administration has also held Israel back from carrying out some of the means it might find necessary to address this challenge, because the Biden administration was determined that the United States would not be drawn into a new conflict in the Middle East. The new administration, I think, needs to be, and probably will be also, less afraid to escalate, or as to achieve goals taking into account the possible risk of escalation. And that's something which I think has characterized Trump in the past and may well also characterize him in the future. One note of concern, which I would add to this very, I guess, optimistic or positive picture that I'm painting of the new administration, is that Trump is, of course, unpredictable. And Trump is a man who likes to make deals and who prides himself on his ability to make deals where nobody else can. So one possible note of concern is that Trump might come in to this saying, right, I'm the man to negotiate a new Iran nuclear deal. I sincerely hope that won't happen, and he'll be sufficiently advised by whoever he picks to be his advisor to realize that would be monumental folly to attempt such a thing. But that's one possible area of concern that we need to be thinking about. So that would be my thoughts in terms of what's most urgent. The Iran file in the region is the most important, both in terms of the nuclear area, but also maybe no less importantly in terms of the bid for domination of the region that Iran has been engaged in over the last decades, which has resulted in its control of a series of Arab countries or spaces, and capitals. And that's what needs to be urgently addressed. And that's what I think will be uppermost with regard to Middle East strategy on the mind of the incoming administration.
With regard to the situation with Iran, what's your opinion of the current state of the Abraham Accords? Do you think they need to be reinvigorated, or have they been depleted by the Biden regime, or have they remained relatively intact?
It's very notable that none of the peace agreements reached in the framework of Abraham Accords have collapsed as a result of the war underway since October 7th, 2023. And that's not nothing. That's not something you can just take for granted. The fact of the matter, as we see from all opinion polls, is that the masses of the population of the Arab world are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, are in many ways hostile, in many parts hostile to Israel. And nevertheless, the accords have held with regard to United Arab Emirates, with regard to Bahrain, and with regard to Morocco also, all very significant gains made by Israel with regard to its relations with the region. And why is that the case? It's because, at least in my estimation, the Abraham Accords were based not on love affair, but on perceptions by the ruling elites of those countries, and most importantly, I think of United Arab Emirates, or it's the most significant partner so far, that there was and is a strategic commonality of interest between the United Arab Emirates, let us say, and the State of Israel with regard to common enemies. The Iranians are one, but also Sunni political Islam in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood, of which, of course, Hamas is a local manifestation. The Emiratis are very worried about Sunni political Islam. And I think also, from the point of view of Mohammed bin Zayed, the main strategic thinker, among other things, of United Arab Emirates, there is a sense that there is a contest underway in the region between two different visions of the region's future. And one of those is geared towards prosperity and development and openness to the world. And from Mohammed bin Zayed's view, the state of Israel represents both an example of that and also a very powerful player in any camp of countries committed to that goal. And these countries are facing a camp of political Islam, of a desire for endless war, of a desire for endless revenge for perceived humiliations, and as a result of a desire or an effective result of endless destruction and impoverishment and suffering on the part of the region's peoples. So those basic strategic or those core strategic building blocks have not vanished as a result of the events of the last year. And as a result, the diplomatic arrangements achieved by the Abraham Accords remain intact. And this is very notable and I think very important. At the same time, we should not be too rosy eyed, so to speak, too optimistic about this, because it is also the case that there has been diplomatic rapprochement over the last year or two between United Arab Emirates specifically and Islamic Republic of Iran. And of course, prior to that, between Saudi Arabia, not yet a member of Abraham Accords, but nevertheless with its leader, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, perhaps with a similar strategic outlook to the one I described a moment ago, held by Mohammed bin Zayed. And nevertheless, both UAE and Saudi Arabia have undergone or underwent a rapprochement with Iran. Why is that? I think it's because these Gulf countries want to stay out of conflict as best they can. They understand they don't do hard power and fighting very well. When they've tried to do it in recent years, most specifically in Yemen, they failed very signally in their fight against the Houthis. They don't think that the Americans are going to be there to back them in any contest with Iran. They don't think that Israel can take the place of the United States, and in this they're probably correct. And as a result, they are hedging their bets, as we would say in English. That's to say, they're trying to have good relations with Israel and the West, and good relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran also. This may well be a built-in limitation of the Abraham Accords. That's to say, anybody who thought that United Arab Emirates, or maybe notionally in the future, Saudi Arabia, if it comes on board to the Abraham Accords, was going to turn into a kind of muscular strategic partner for Israel and the West against Iran, was maybe being a bit optimistic. Certainly, to get to that point, which we like to get to, of course, it would need a much more assertive American stance in the region. Only that would make the Emiratis and maybe somewhere down the line, the Saudis feel safe enough to sort of shelter beneath the cover afforded by such an alliance. For as long as they feel that America still wants out of the region, they will try to make their rapprochement with Iran. So I would say this is a mixed picture. On the one hand, the Abraham Accords have held firm, they have not collapsed, and there is no sign that they will collapse. On the second hand, however, we also now know and experience the built-in limitations of the Abraham Accords. Any notion that the Abraham Accords were going to signify a strong, tough, new strategic alliance, a kind of iron wall against the advance of the Iranians or political Islam across the region, needs to be not abandoned, but certainly complicated and qualified. With regard to Saudi Arabia's no, hoped for coming on board to the Abraham Accords. My sense is that the war launched by Yahya Sinwar and Hamas on October 7th, 2023, may well have postponed very significantly Saudi Arabia's joining of the Accords and reaching diplomatic rapprochement with Israel. I've read a lot of analysis which suggests that that was one of the late Yahya Sinwar's goals in launching the October 7th attacks and massacres. If indeed it was, then to some degree he has achieved his goal, I think. I think not forever. In other words, the underlying strategic logic which will draw, and also, I would add, economic logic, which will draw Mohammed bin Salman towards rapprochement with Israel, remains in place and will eventually find expression, and indeed already does find expression in many practical, behind the scenes modes of cooperation between Israel, both the Israeli private sector and elements of the Israeli state sector. But these are unlikely to be formalized into official diplomatic relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and therefore, so to speak, Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords for as long as the present war continues. Wars
Right.
don't last forever. And I think when this war ends, then we'll be back where we were before in terms of the potential regarding Saudi Arabia and
Mm.
the Abraham Accords. But for as long as the guns are blazing, so to speak, and I don't think it looks like they're going to stop firing in the immediate future, for as long as the guns are blazing, then it's unlikely that there'll be diplomatic advance in that regard. They say there's a saying, isn't there, when the cannons roar, the muses are silent. So I think that applies to this issue as well. For as long as the fighting is going on, we're very unlikely to see
Okay.
diplomatic advancement between Israel
Right.
and Saudi Arabia.
Right. Let me just call Chiara. Chiara, would you like to pose a few questions? Chiara?
Chiara, mi senti?
Sì,
Chiara?
mi sentite?
Chiara?
Mi sentite?
Chiara, hai domande per il dottor Spire?
Mi sentite voi?
Sì, ti sentiamo. Sì.
Ah, ok, sì.
Ok.
Volevo chiedere,
Fale in inglese, fale in inglese, no?
Ah, wow, ok, ci proviamo. Okay, I know you are an expert of Iraq,
So che lei è un esperto di Iraq.
and I know you know very well the story of the Iraqi
Bene la storia
Saddam Hussein.
di Saddam Hussein.
And we see that when a leader fall down, the
Abbiamo visto
situation
che quando cade un leader
situation in the country changes.
La situazione nello Stato cambia.
What about the leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah that have been
Pensa
killed?
quindi di quello che succederà ai leader di Hamas, per esempio.
Che sono stati, they has been killed.
Yes.
Sono stati uccisi.
So the situation will change on your opinion, and how
Secondo lei quindi la situazione cambierà?
how deep is the wound that Israeli Defense Forces
Quanto è profonda quindi la ferita che che ha afflitto l'esercito israeliano?
To these terrorist organizations?
Yes. Thanks for that, Chiara. Well, first of all, I should say that I do very much subscribe to the view that individuals have a crucial role to play in strategic processes. In other words, there is a cliche in English which says that the graveyards are full of indispensable men, which is supposed to mean that actually it might seem that individuals are very important, but somebody else can always be found to do the job that is left vacant by the disappearance of this or that individual. And I think that's not accurate. I think that actually individuals do play a key role, and the removal of significant leaders can very profoundly change the balance and the picture. You mentioned Saddam Hussein. The removal of Saddam Hussein arguably should stand as a warning against the notion that getting rid of this or that regime will necessarily produce something better. What the removal of Saddam Hussein has done, in my estimation, is it has ended up handing Iraq over to the effective stewardship of Islamic Republic of Iran. So this was the outcome of the disappearance of Saddam. But with regard to the removal of not only Hassan Nasrallah, by the way, with regard to Lebanese Hezbollah, but also the entire top leadership echelon of Lebanese Hezbollah has now been wiped out. And as we saw with the Israeli attack on using pagers or beepers and then walkie-talkies, a whole second layer of between 2 and 3,000 operatives have been sort of taken out of action as well. So this Hezbollah movement has suffered a really telling blow, a really significant series of blows, of setbacks. Similarly, with regard to Hamas, it's not only Yahya Sinwar whose removal is significant. Effectively, excuse me, effectively, the whole Hamas governing structure, which ruled the Gaza Strip from 2007 onwards, has ceased to exist. So these are very, very significant blows indeed. It will take both Lebanese Hezbollah and Palestinian Hamas years to get anywhere close to the capacities which both of them had on October 6th, 2023, so to speak. So the damage is very, very significant. It is questionable whether Hezbollah, for example, has or will come up with leaders or a leader of the capacity of the late Hassan Nasrallah. Hassan Nasrallah was a very significant and very, very able figure who, let us remember, came to leadership of Hezbollah in 1992, conducted a successful insurgency against Israel in the subsequent 8 years that led to Israeli unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon in May of 2000, and then stewarded the effective swallowing up of the Lebanese state by the Hezbollah organization. This was a very, very powerful and consequential leader indeed. And there are no indications yet whatsoever that Hezbollah has anybody waiting in the wings of anything close to the abilities and capacities that Nasrallah had. So I think that his removal from the board and the other blows I mentioned have very significantly set Lebanese Hezbollah back. They have not destroyed the organization. And they have not ended, and this is very important to remember, they have not ended the situation in which Hezbollah remains the single most powerful player within Lebanon. It may have been hit hard by Israel, but it's still stronger by an order of magnitude, by the way, I think, to any of its potential competitors inside Lebanon. So, yes, a very
Okay.
significant blow, but not in any way a terminal blow,
Yeah.
not to Hezbollah and also not to
Let
Hamas.
me just come in there, Jonathan. So, how do you see things playing out in Lebanon, and what do you think Israel's policy should be with regard to Lebanon and indeed its goals in the medium-term future?
Ideally speaking, Israel, of course, does not wish to and is not going to do something similar to what it did in the summer of 1982 when it sent an army all the way to Beirut to destroy the de facto domination of the country by then Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization. Nothing similar to that is going to happen with Hezbollah, as the army is not going to go all the way to Beirut to besiege it and force Hezbollah to sail off to wherever, to Algeria or wherever else they would sail off to, or Iran or whatever it is. Given that that is not going to happen, what has to happen, in my estimation at least, is that an effective de facto domination of the ground between the Israeli border and the Litani River by Israel has to be brought into being. Nothing less than that will enable the 80,000 internally displaced people, Israelis, who left their homes in border communities after October 8th, 2023, to return to their homes. So it is
So
a
we're
matter
saying, sorry, Jonathan,
of
what you're saying is that Israel requires a security zone which it will control up to the Litani River,
well,
and
yeah, no, not quite. What I wanted to say was that Marco, was that that's the goal is effective de facto domination of that area.
yeah.
And then the question is, how do you do that?
Mm.
One way that you can do it, which in my opinion would be optimal, but I think that for reasons we can go into is probably not going to happen, would be, yeah, a buffer zone. The buffer zone doesn't have to be all the way to the Litani, but it can be 3 or 4 kilometers at least along the borderline where
Yes.
Israel imposes a de facto demilitarized zone, and anything that comes in to that zone without authorization gets wiped out by Israeli firepower. Israel has the capacity to do that. It can do that without a major occupation of that area. And I think it should be done. I also think it probably won't be done because I think that the United States, and of course the Europeans as well, but the United States is the important one, will not permit that to happen.
Mhm.
Given that that probably will not happen, Israel must, in any case, as a fallback stance, insist on freedom of Israeli response across the border to any perceived violation of the situation in which Hezbollah is not permitted to rebuild south of the Litani. Israel should insist on that. And if any agreement to end the current operation in Lebanon does not include that, Israel should not, and indeed must not, in my opinion, agree to it. Otherwise,
Mhm.
the absolute bottom line from an Israeli point of view must be that if Israel sees south of the Litani that Hezbollah is rebuilding, Israel must be free to act militarily to prevent that and to destroy that. And the reason we know that that's so necessary is because we know what happened in South Lebanon between the end of the war of 2006 and October 8th, 2023, which is that despite the fact that there was a UN Security Council resolution, Resolution 1701, which expressly forbade Hezbollah arming south of the Litani River, and in spite of the fact that there was both the Lebanese armed forces and a large United Nations force tasked with implementing 1701, no such implementation took place. A massive Hezbollah war machine was built, which has now largely been destroyed by Israel, which means a return to that arrangement is not good enough. If Israel can't get to a buffer zone north of the border, then Israeli freedom of action absolutely must be nevertheless maintained in such an eventuality.
Hezbollah, however, is rather problematic in the sense that it is a military industrial complex. Its source of funding, I believe, and I watched one of your presentations, they are heavily involved in the drug trade. Correct
Hmm.
me if I'm mistaken.
Hmm.
Can you
Hmm.
elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, both the Lebanese Hezbollah and the Assad regime, its partner regime in Syria, the Assad regime in Syria, have effectively created a kind of narco state, in maybe the Middle East's first, or the Levant's first narco state in recent years. The product, rather, in question is a drug called Captagon, which sells very well down in the Gulf. And yes, this drug is being produced in tablet form in Lebanon and in Syria, and then it is being transported uh, with the assistance of smuggling families on both sides of the Syrian-Jordanian border down through Jordan, and then from Jordan down into the markets of the Gulf where it is sold, and it produces a very significant income for both Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, and for the Assad regime in Syria. I should add in parentheses that the same smuggling routes from Syria across to Jordan are also being used for the smuggling of weapons into Judea and Samaria, the West.
Yes.
So the same families
Can
trade
I
with
just
drugs and
stop
weapons.
you
Yes,
there
please.
for 1 second? Because
Please.
this seems to be a really serious shortcoming on the part of the state of Israel, that smuggling should have been able to take place for so long. Why did the Israeli authorities fall asleep at the post with regard to the smuggling operations from Jordan into Judea and Samaria?
Yeah.
Or did they fall asleep at the post and simply turn a blind eye, enslaved by old conceptions?
Yeah, I think to some degree the latter is the case. I mean, to some degree, unfortunately, I think the Israeli authorities, for as long as there wasn't a fire burning, uh, had stuff, felt that they had stuff to focus on elsewhere. And as a result, that long, poorly maintained border between Israel and Jordan was kind of permitted to become, I don't want to say completely porous, because that would be an exaggeration, but certainly was permitted to witness very clear examples of smuggling. And because the weapons were not immediately forming a security threat, so little was done. It's very
Mm.
interesting to note what Iran and its allies are doing in this. They're not trying to stand up an immediate insurgent force, a sort of hierarchical insurgent structure, because they understand if they tried to do that, Israel would notice it and would then destroy it. They're doing something else. They're flooding the West Bank with weaponry and then making that available to ad hoc gatherings of young men to try to then carry out terror attacks. But until the terror attacks start to happen, the problem will not be afforded sufficient primacy in the list of problems that the Israeli security system has to deal with. And as a result, complacency will and has
Yes,
resulted.
I think complacency has been very much the operative concept here with regard to Israeli policy in the past
Yeah.
30 to 40 years. Um, I wanted to turn our gaze to the southern border with Egypt, because I think this has been underestimated for a long time, because logically, weapons must have been smuggled across the border from what is sovereign Egyptian territory. What's your opinion on the activity of the Egyptian government with regard to the southern border?
Well, I think clearly there's strong evidence of massive or considerable corruption on the part of Egyptian commanders in place, which enabled the large-scale smuggling of weaponry to happen. I suspect that behind that, of course, there is also a kind of strategic conception, if I can put it that way. That's to say, an officer who takes a bribe to allow something as serious as that to happen is a person who, in a way, is not acting only through financial greed. he's acting through financial greed.
Yeah.
But behind that financial greed is actually a political conception, which
Indeed,
he
he's not
obviously,
afraid. He's not afraid of the consequences
yeah, he
of the
doesn't.
Egyptian state. They're
Because
not
he
going to.
assumes, yeah, because
That's
he
right.
assumes that the weaponry will be put, and correctly, he assumes
Yes,
that the weaponry will be pointed at Israel, and he doesn't mind that or probably supports it. And
indeed.
that I think is reflective of a very major problem, which is, and we need to not shy away from this, that while the Camp David Accords concluded in 1979 between Israel and Egypt are the longest standing and still standing peace agreement between Israel and any Arab country, they do not enjoy the support of the Egyptian populace, to put it mildly.
Hmm.
All available polling indeed suggests that the Egyptian population is among the most anti-Israeli and
Yes,
anti-Jewish
indeed. Yeah,
populations
yeah.
of the entire region. And this is reflected, I think, certainly in popular sentiment and also in the kind of activities which we now know were taking place in the months and years prior to October 7th,
Hmm.
2023 on the southern border.
Indeed, indeed. What about the? Let's have a look at Jordan. What about the stability or lack thereof of the Hashemite regime? What can you tell us about that?
My own view is that, you know, the Hashemite regime is never stable and it's always on the verge of collapsing, or it's always within visible distance of possible collapse. But at least up until now, it never collapses. That's to say, it's been around now for, you know, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in many ways was regarded as an anachronism from the very moment that it came into existence, in the sense that, through the 40s and 50s, and 60s, secular Arab nationalism was regarded as the wave of the future, as exemplified most obviously in the regime of Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. And the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, it was assumed, would soon be swept away by an Arab nationalist revolution. And when the Arab Spring came, now a decade and a half ago, many people assumed that surely this rather fragile monarchy would soon fall victim to a revolution of one kind or another. And it didn't happen. And there are reasons, I think, why it didn't happen. And it's worthwhile noting a couple of them. First of all, the Hashemite regime of Jordan does enjoy Islamic legitimacy, and this is not something which one should take mildly. The Bani Hashem, the ruling family, can legitimately, or at least plausibly, claim descent from the Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. This
Hmm.
affords enormous legitimacy of a
Yeah,
kind which no sort of jumped up colonel or major uh,
right.
can claim to. This is one. Secondly, let us remember, whilst we're always reminding ourselves, especially as Israeli observers, that the majority of Jordan's population is Palestinian, and indeed that's correct. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of the population of Jordan is Palestinian. It's worth remembering that both Jordanian Palestinians and East Bank Bedouin Jordanians are Arabic-speaking Sunni Muslims, right? Both populations are
Hmm.
those, which means, from the point of view of the Middle East in 2024, the differences between them are in no way anywhere close to the kind of divisions that exist among the populations of, for example, Iraq or Syria or Lebanon. There is a certain homogeneity among the population of Jordan, which means that, for my money at least, yeah, the monarchy faces very considerable challenges, but I would be nowhere close to predicting the imminent fall of the Jordanian monarchy anytime soon. I
Hmm.
think we'd be getting way ahead of ourselves if we were to start to be thinking of Jordan
Hmm.
in that situation right now.
Indeed, Israel has also been a guarantor of
Yes,
the Hashemite regime, going way back to Assad the Elder, if I'm not mistaken.
correct, in 1970.
Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, Looking a little further north, we see that Mr. Erdogan takes an active and emotive involvement in affairs. What do you see his role as being? To which audience is he playing? Or
I
to
mean,
which
Erdogan,
audience?
yeah, my sense is that Erdogan is a figure of historic importance. I think, that has become apparent in recent years, that Erdogan is engaged in a very profound transformation of Turkish society, and also of as a aspect of that, of Turkey's international relations. And Turkey is on the way from being what it was, of course, during the period of high Kemalism, i.e., a core NATO ally, a core Western ally, to being something quite different, namely a country whose automatic position, so to speak, is to take an anti-Western role, but at the same time, because of economic uh, connections, won't go all the way towards an anti-Western stance, but who will seek to build alliances with anti-Western states, whether it is China, whether it is Russia, even Iran in certain circumstances, and then try to balance that with its remaining commitments to the United States and to NATO. I think we should not dismiss in any way the element of political Islam in President Erdogan's thinking. I think if we look at the fact that he has backed and is backing Muslim Brotherhood type organizations, also in Libya, also in terms of his close relations with Qatar, which backs the Muslim Brothers all the way across the region, also in terms of his support, of course, for Hamas, now going back years and decades. Uh, we understand, of course, also his domiciling in northwest Syria of the remaining Sunni Arab Islamist rebels in that country. We can see a pattern is emerging, and the pattern is that Turkey is moving away from its, or has moved far away from the pro-Western position it once had. It is seeking to opportunistically back any anti-Western power that's out there,
Yes.
and it
Yeah.
is systematically backing Sunni political Islam wherever it can. And indeed, Turkey today, I would say, can be seen as the main backer of Sunni political Islam across the Middle East.
Mm.
Those are the key
Yeah.
elements I would
Yeah.
point.
What do you, thank you, Jonathan. What do you see as Qatar's role?
Qatar is once again the bankroller and the main cheerleader of Sunni political Islam. The Arab Spring revolts were largely a Qatari production. That's to say, it was the Al Jazeera satellite channel that sort of fanned the flames of Sunni Islamist revolt
Mm.
from Tunisia and across to Egypt and thence to Syria and so on. Uh, and Qatar remains, I would say, a country which seeks to back radicalism and then to, in a sense, gain a seat at the top table, if I can put
Mm.
it that way, of Middle
Yeah.
Eastern
Yeah.
strategy and diplomacy as a result of its connections to extremist and radical forces. So, a nice way many people use this uh, metaphor, where they say that Qatar is both the arsonist and the firefighter.
Indeed. Indeed.
Qatar
That's
first of all sets the fires, and then it comes along and says, "I can help you. You need this fire putting out. I can help you do that." And that's the
yes.
nature of the Qatari
It's a
game.
it's like a bit like a protection racket.
Very much so. Yeah, very much
Um,
so. And they've played it well, and they continue to play it. And frankly, I must add, they continue to play it because the West continues to
well,
believe it.
that's the whole point, isn't it? Here,
Yeah,
nobody has raised any significant objection to that,
right.
let alone the European Union. And
Yes,
the
right.
role of the European Union isn't viewed particularly in a positive light in Israel. And what is your understanding of the position and policy, if it may be called that, of the European Union?
I don't think the European Union has a coherent policy or strategy towards the Middle East, and this is a reflection, I would suggest, of the fact that the whole European ambition to produce a common foreign and security policy via the European Union has effectively been unsuccessful because at the end of the day, the national states, the main national states of the Union, have differing interests and differing outlooks, even to a degree, and therefore are unable to work together on anything more than the symbolic level regarding the Middle East. On
Right.
the symbolic level, there's a great deal of importance, of course, attached to what the Europeans and the West still calls the Middle East peace process, by which they mean the entirely illusory notion that there is a possibility of rapprochement between the Israelis and the Palestinian national movement as a result of partition of the country. I'm not saying that's a good or bad idea. It's just a
No, I
completely
understand. Yeah,
unrealistic one at the
yeah,
moment.
yeah,
The
yeah.
Europeans on the symbolic level remain committed to that. But they, I think, on the practical level, don't spend really a great amount of time trying to get to it because, of course, there is no way to get to it. And on the practical level, in terms of the region, as you mentioned a moment ago with regard to Qatar, the point is that European capitals are awash with Qatari money. They are awash with Emirati and Saudi
Indeed.
money as well. And these, at the end of the day, dictate to a great extent.
Indeed, indeed. It's a bit like I use this metaphor. It's a bit like getting into an illicit relationship. It's very hard to get out of.
Right. Yes, indeed.
Um, I just wanted to turn our gaze to Russia and Putin because it's a very peculiar relationship that it has with Israel. What are your views on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, with regard to Russia, and Israel, we need to remember that Russia and Israel are neighbors, in the sense that Russia has a physical presence in Syria. It has a very important air base in Khmeimim, and it has significant naval facilities in Tartus and in Latakia, all of which are on Syria's western coast, and all of which are of considerable importance to Russia to maintain, which means that Israel has had to take Russian preferences and desires into account when formulating its strategy of trying to limit and turn back Iranian consolidation and placement of weaponry in Syria. The Syrian issue has been the most significant with regard to the Israeli-Russian relationship. This issue, I think, beyond any other, has led to Israel's cautious diplomatic approach to the Ukrainian conflict,
Yes,
where Israel
yes.
has not sort of followed along with the West European consensus, which I don't know may also itself be fraying now,
Mm,
but the consensus that certainly existed for the months following February 2022, when the invasion began, of very strong support for Ukraine. Israel hasn't gone down that road. It can't afford to, because for Israel, a primary strategic goal is preventing the Iranian advance across Syria, and the Russians could seriously disrupt that process or make
right.
problems, at least, should they wish to. And
There
Israel's
seemed,
determined
yeah,
against
that's
that.
right. There seemed to have been some tacit understandings prior to the 7th of October between the Russians and the Israelis. They tended not to tread one another's
Yeah,
feet too much. There seemed to have been mechanisms in place at least.
I think that's right. But I do think that the trend in this regard is not good, because if we think, and I think it's right to discern an emergent closer alliance of anti-Western countries globally, in which Russia and Iran are both elements, then the likelihood is for further and closer Iranian-Russian
Right,
cooperation. We know
right.
that as a result of the Ukraine invasion, this is no longer a one-way street. Iranian support is now vital to the Russian war effort in Ukraine. Most importantly, as we know, in regard to the production and deployment of Iranian cheap, effective Iranian drones
Mm,
against civilian targets, mostly inside Ukraine. So the trend lines are towards greater Russian-Iranian cooperation, which means that the trend lines will be towards greater and greater Israeli-Russian estrangement, I would suggest, in the
yeah,
year.
so that's going to put a strain on the relationship if things continue playing out in the same way.
Yeah.
Looking a little further north, Israel has some interesting understandings with Azerbaijan. There seems to
Yeah.
be a confluence of interest there. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, the issue, of course, there is with regard to Iran and its geopolitics. It is that Azerbaijan and Iran, of course, have a common border, and while both countries are Shia Muslim majority countries, they're nevertheless not aligned with one another in this regard.
Mm,
And it means that from an Israeli point of view, to have good relations with Azerbaijan, it makes obvious geopolitical sense. Of course, it upsets the Armenians, but the Armenians are close to Iran, so they don't necessarily
indeed.
get a vote in
Indeed.
this matter. There's a natural geopolitical or geostrategic confluence of interest, and we don't know the full details of this, of course, but I assume, and I think most observers would assume that, with regard to intelligence gathering and perhaps also with regard to sort of covert action across the border as well, there's a lot going on from an Israeli point of view with
It's a
regard
busy area. It's
to
a
the busy
busy.
area. Also, let's remember that in a certain sense, just as Iran has been trying to, using its own methods, proxy warfare and so on, to envelop Israel with forces operating on behalf of Iran, so Israel, through more conventional diplomatic and strategic methods, is trying to implement a kind of counter envelopment of Iran, in which Israel draws closer to countries which matter from a geostrategic point of view, adjoining Iran. Azerbaijan is an example of that. United Arab Emirates is another example of that. And you can
Yes.
probably think of other examples too.
Yes, yes, except they don't launch missiles from their territories.
No, they do not.
Right. Zooming out a little further, because obviously Israel is at the crossroads and intersections of many interests. What do you see in the future? And this, I will wind up on this last point.
Mm.
Um, the influence of China and Russia. Sorry, and India.
Oh, okay. Well, with regard to China, my view is that maybe China's future Middle Eastern role is the most interesting question of all. My sense, at least, is that China is moving similarly towards a position of more and more overt anti-Western and anti-US, a more overt anti-Western and anti-US stance, which means that Chinese-Israel relations are already suffering. As a
Mm,
result of that, we saw that the Chinese have not really clearly condemned even the October 7th massacre. And they've very seriously condemned Israel's subsequent military actions. My sense is that the Chinese famously have said they're engaged mainly in trading with regard to the region, but certainly in their brokering of the Iranian Saudi rapprochement a couple of years ago, they dipped a cautious toe, so to speak, into Middle Eastern diplomacy. And I would suggest that we're going to be seeing more of that in the years ahead. So the Chinese will continue to trade with everybody. They'll continue, as we know, to try to build ports and to try to build facilities which potentially in the future could have strategic importance, even if for the moment they only have economic and commercial importance. And I think the diplomacy will be increasingly towards support for anti-Western forces. But that won't detract from the Chinese desire to do business with everybody. In other words, they'll continue to buy oil from the Saudis, they'll continue to trade with Israel, but at the same time, the diplomatic stances will increasingly, I think, in years ahead, lean towards a greater and greater anti-Western position. And regarding India, India, of course, is the well-kept secret of Israeli diplomacy. Israel doesn't tend to shout from the rooftops its successes for whatever reason. There is an emergent strategic partnership between India and the State of Israel. It's gone well beyond the burgeoning security relationship, which, of course, has been in place now for some years. The talk of a network, a sort of trade route linking India, Emirates, and then Israel across the region as on going on to the Mediterranean and to Europe, I think is a key strategic goal of both countries in the years ahead. And what that I think reflects is a very great commonality of interests and of perceptions also between the current ruling elite in India and the current ruling elite, if I can put it that way, in Israel. And that's
mm,
something I think which is we don't pay enough attention to that. I think it's very
mm.
significant indeed.
Right, 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 right. Chiara, is there anything you'd like to add? Chiara, we need the microphone. Okay, thank you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you so much because what you share is very, very interesting. I would like to ask you on your opinion, if there will never be a mediator, who might be a mediator, possible mediator of a ceasefire, of a peace agreement with these two war front lines, with Hamas
Regarding,
and
yes.
Hezbollah.
Well, you mean regarding Hamas and regarding Hezbollah in Lebanon? I mean, de facto, the only power which can, which can move towards an arrangement of one or another kind is the United States of America. Nobody else can do it because who else would be the candidates we would think of? Turkey, Egypt, the Europeans. None of these are, for obvious reasons, really, with anything like the magnitude. The French, perhaps in Lebanon, many of these countries maybe would like to play such a role, but none of them are going to be able to. But the question really, I think, comes back, unfortunately, to the fact, I think, of an absence of clear strategic thinking on the Israeli side. With even if a new American administration were to come in now and say, okay, we want to, with you, partner with you towards bringing these conflicts to a satisfactory conclusion, it's not quite clear that the current Israeli government exactly knows what it wants as a future arrangement in Gaza or what it wants as a future arrangement on the border with Lebanon. So I think there is a certain amount of strategic drift taking place in Israel alongside the very clear military gains. And I hope that the new US administration will help to play a role in clarifying what the future arrangements in both those areas will be.
Vai avanti, Chiara.
Yes, if you can share, I don't know if your opinion, of course. What about this new change of war cabinet leader? Gallant has been dismissed a few days ago.
Yeah, well, my opinion is that I don't think it's a good thing. Yoav Gallant, you can be critical of. Everyone can be criticized, of course, but Gallant, who I met on a number of occasions prior to his being defense minister, is, I think, a supremely capable manager of combat. The incoming new defense minister, Israel Katz, has a far more modest military background. He has a small military background. He was a company commander in the airborne infantry. It's very nice, but nothing remotely close to the professional capacities of Gallant, which means that we now have a cabinet in which there's nobody who held general's rank in the army. My opinion as a citizen is that is not an appropriate cabinet to have at a time of a massively complicated war in which the country is engaged. So I think it's a matter of considerable regret that the Prime Minister has chosen to take this move in the way he did at the time that he has done so.
If I may ask the last question. If I'm right, you were in Lebanon war in 2006 as a
That's
reservist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it changed the strategies of war in this last Lebanon war with the Hezbollah, you think? And I know also you went to the Gaza Strip few months ago. So you maybe are aware of the new strategies of war nowadays.
Yeah, I do think that with regard to Lebanon, there is a difference because I think in 2006, there was a complete confusion of political and military aims on the part of the Olmert government at that time, simply in the sense that Olmert, if you remember, in the Knesset on July, I've forgotten the exact date, perhaps 18th. Don't hold me to that exact date. But Olmert gave a speech in Knesset where he set down very clear, very ambitious goals regarding the war, of the disarmament of Hezbollah, of the return of the what he thought were the captured Israelis, the two soldiers who in the end turned out to have died. And of course, having set those very unrealistic goals, he then had no military strategy for how to actually carry those out, and a very inconsequential military campaign was conducted for 3 weeks until the United States called time on the campaign and the war came to an inconclusive end. What's currently going on, I think, is a little bit more coherent than that. The government has not set itself publicly unattainable or unrealistic goals. It's kept very quiet, actually, as to what exactly is going on close to the border. And I think what is going on close to the border is the systematic destruction of Hezbollah's capacity all the way along the borders. And that's good work. And that's something which certainly needs to be done. My own sense, at least, as I said earlier, is that it's vital that Israel does not end the current campaign without, at the very least, a situation accepted by the United States in which Israel has freedom of action south of the Litani against Hezbollah should it begin to try to rebuild there. But my sense is that a fairly modest and clear and realistic set of goals appear to be being pursued by Israel now in South Lebanon with considerable success. So it's a quite different and I think much more positive picture to the 2006 war, in which, as you mentioned, I was a participant as a reservist soldier.
That's right. That's right. One last question, and then we won't abuse you any longer. We've taken up quite a bit of your time. The situation in Judea and Samaria.
Mm.
There seems to be a lot of work that needs to be done there.
Yes, well, there is, as we mentioned earlier, the result of the flooding of Judea and Samaria with weaponry is that there has been an emergence of sort of ad hoc militias. Remember, there was the Jenin Battalion, there was the Lion's Den group in Nablus, and
Yes.
a number of others too. And this is not a problem which has been completely addressed at the moment. However, I think what has happened, and it's an important achievement, is that the fire has not got out of control in Judea and Samaria at a time when Israel is fighting an active war on a number of fronts. It's an achievement that the lid has been kept on Judea and Samaria, and that is the case. And I think that will probably, as of now, at least without wishing to make dangerous predictions, it looks like for the immediate future that's going to continue to be the case. Without any question, Sinwar and the Hamas leadership hoped that there would be a fully fledged uprising, indeed a fully fledged armed insurgency underway in Judea and Samaria by now. There isn't. And that, I think, is testimony to a certain modest but significant success with regard to Israeli policy there at the present time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Speyer, for your enlightening thoughts on the current situation, geopolitical situation. Thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to hosting you again sometime again in the future. Thank you so much.
I look forward to it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.